Center for the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and the Center for European Studies. And I'm very glad that we have this lecture today by Scott Greer, entitled now The Territorial Politics of Brexit, which is part of our mini-series on regionalism. 2 weeks ago, we had a roundtable also on different regional movements and separatist movements, Catalonia, Scotland, and Northern Italy in absentia. Yes. And Scott was there and actually entered in a very interesting dialogue with Kali Israel, who's here, about Scotland. So we're kind of hoping to continue the conversation about the meaning, what it means for Scotland specifically, what Brexit means for Scotland more specifically. So before we go into Scott's talk, he wants to say something. I thought you were about to interrupt me. I will formally introduce him. So Scott Greer is Professor of Health Management and Policy and Global Public Health at the University of Michigan. His work is on the politics of health policy with a special focus on the EU and the impact of federalism on healthcare. He's the author, co-author, or editor of too many books. I can't really name all of them. I will just name a few recent ones. Everything you always wanted to know about European Union health policies but were afraid to ask, 2014. That title now, with what's going on with Woody Allen, might be a little risque. Strengthening Health System Governance, Better Policies, Stronger Performance, 2015. Federalism and Decentralization in European Health and Social Care, 2013. And European Union Public Health Policies. Extremely well accomplished, a political scientist in the School of Public Health, and we're very happy that he can address these important issues as it relates to Scotland and Brexit more. And Ireland, well, will you be talking about Ireland
You're
as well?
definitely getting some Ireland.
Okay, so thank you. So we should have about 20 minutes at the end for conversation.
And thank you for having me. And I think the attempt to focus on Scotland and the late entry of Ireland will prove to be humorous when you see more of the talk. Do these men look happy? They are the leaders of one of the most remarkable and improbably victorious political movements in modern British history on the day of their victory. For those of you who don't recognize them, they're Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, and as you can infer from their podium and their backdrop, they were two of the leaders of the civilized pro-Brexit Leave campaign. Prominent conservatives. You can probably argue that among the many things that influenced the result, if Boris Johnson had not agreed to support the Leave campaign, it probably wouldn't have won. His personal vote might have been the margin, along with some other things. Nonetheless, they've won. And I think they're both very smart men. It's dawning on them that they've got some problems ahead. So this is the outline of the talk. The first one is the salient fact about Brexit is that it's an amazing feat of daring do. They've jumped off the building. They're going down, they're going down, they're going down. They pass the 45th floor and they say, so far so good. They pass the 40th floor and they say, so far so good. The aspect that I've been thinking about for the last 20 years of British politics is devolution, namely political autonomy of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Its political bases, its operation. I used to do something that you could actually call that rarest of creatures, applied political science, when I worked at University College London and had a hand in working on devolution policy. From the point of view of these three jurisdictions and the UK that they're part of and constitute, we have three essential things I'm going to say. One is that Wales is a loser. One is that Scotland is a loser but dangerously fractured. And one is that Ireland is coming for you. So let us begin with the vote. Many of you have seen this map. This is the electoral map of Brexit. There is a line across Britain from the Severn, that's my little dot there around Bristol, to the Wash here. As a rule of thumb, south of here is highly educated, relatively young, growing economically. London, of course, is its beating heart. above the Severn to the Wash line, it's bad. I like to say that the United Kingdom, that New York State is actually functionally the United Kingdom governed by France, meaning you have the beautiful, amazing world city with a post-industrial wasteland out back and a very, very invasive and centralized state superimposed on top. Now, in the Brexit vote, what you see is that in England, the Severn to the Wash line works fine. Blue means you voted to leave. Darker blue means you voted more enthusiastically to leave. However, it breaks down in interesting ways once you get out of England. Scotland entirely voted to remain in the European Union, although I'll point out on low turnout. Now, it might just be that the Scots are sick of having referenda, but nonetheless, the Scots didn't vote with anything like the enthusiasm that the English voted. Wales, I'm going to draw your attention to this little sparsely populated area. That is the fraction of Wales that is majority Welsh-speaking. They voted to stay in. And over here we have Northern Ireland. Basically, this is sectarian voting. The Protestants voted to stay out, and the Catholics voted to leave. So coloring them green and blue is actually relatively appropriate here. So two lessons. One is the declining parts of England and Wales voted to leave. However, Welsh speakers, all Scots, and Catholic Northern Irelanders didn't want to leave the European Union. Bear that in mind. Now, I'm going to talk most of the time about the consequences of that vote, because what the vote demonstrated is something all Americans know, which is essentially that elderly, poorly educated, white people who perceive downward mobility and don't like non-whites voted to leave. Well, yeah, fine. West Virginia is the same. It's not a very interesting story. At one point, the Sun claimed the Queen supported Brexit, and I thought, well, poorly educated, white woman in her 80s. Yeah. But since then, we're supposed to have policy consequences. I do public policy. And the problem is that instead of policy consequences, the UK put on the most extraordinary show of political gladiators. The reason I have this up is this is the M20 motorway, which runs from London to Dover. This is what it looks like after Port of Dover has closed for 6 hours. Okay, that's a special mechanism they have. The lorries pointing the other way, they're also trying to go the direction of the completely log-jammed route. It's that they close the motorway and use the other direction as a second parking area. Now, Dover, if it slows down by the creation of customs, is going to need a parking lot the size of the M20 motorway several times over. If you go to Kent, you are not going to see an enormous construction project. You are not going to see a single new building or a single job ad for a customs officer or an immigration officer. You are certainly not going to see the hundreds of square miles of car park that would be required to manage that volume of traffic. Instead, you see people having arguments about whether or not so-and-so would be a good leader of the Conservative Party. So the UK, like I said, they're at the 40th floor, so far so good. They're at the 35th floor, so far so good. The problem is there's a hard deadline. At midnight Brussels time, on March 29th of next year, they're out. And by 6 a.m., that's what the M20 is going to look like. And there's no forward planning. The Port of Dover has done nothing because the Port of Dover doesn't know what's going to happen. Iterate that across every aspect of British life. This makes the life of the policy analyst like me a little bit challenging, of course. Let us have a quick look at what we do know about the consequences. That's me with the Brexit bus. I thought it was going to be a curiosity. Had I known that I'd be using this photograph in presentations all around the world, I probably would have dressed better. But nonetheless, I've actually seen it. It exists. Brexit is a vote for long-term economic decline, okay? It's very specifically impeding the United Kingdom's ability to carry out the sectors that essentially give it its money. The problem with voting for long-term economic decline is nothing goes wrong the day after, especially if you don't do any planning. If they were flattening most of Kent to create lorry parks for the vehicles that couldn't get through Dover efficiently, then people in Kent would notice. But they're not, because they're not planning. So we see effectively no consequences. The UK has lost geopolitical authority, the EU has lost geopolitical authority, but that's also not something you notice in day-to-day life. So the UK is gently declining, but not in a way that you're going to notice if you just live there. Now, Where you're starting to see the negative effects, because the tax base is being shrunk, is on the public services. And along with Boris Johnson's personal endorsement, that claim on the bus was the single most effective thing that the Brexit campaign had for it. We send the EU £50 million a week, let's fund the NHS instead. That use of the NHS logo, by the way, is completely illegal. If any of you just went and put up a business and put that on it without permission, that's actually, you could be hit with a fairly large fine. Now, the joke is that there's certain areas of the UK that aren't going to feel it that hard initially. For example, there's a huge concentration of pharmaceutical researchers around Cambridge. They're not moving. They're not moving on. They have kids in school. They have houses. They have mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the United States isn't necessarily going to take migrants. So Cambridgeshire, which voted to remain, is going to stay rich on this patrimony of pharmaceutical labor market that it's built up for a long time to come. By contrast, most of the places that are really going to get hurt are north of the Severn to the Wash. This is a reproduction from an academic article. It's the best academic article, this green monster I've put in front of you, but it's got the display skills of an academic article. If you can make out the different quality of, if you can make out the different levels of green, the darker green you are, the more of your GDP is exposed to Brexit. You will notice that there's a loose identity that a lot of northwest England, is heavily exposed to Brexit. London is entirely vanished into the black borders of its shape, but London is by far the least European-focused area of the UK. London's going to do best after voting resoundingly to stay in. The people who are really going to get hurt voted overwhelmingly to leave. Now, this same study also tells us about the fatuity of Mr. Boris Johnson, who argued that the Italians would like to sell Prosecco and therefore the UK will get a good deal from the EU. You notice all that dark green? That's up to 18% of your GDP will be affected by Brexit. You notice all that light green? That's less than 4%. So most of the European Union is going to feel absolutely nothing from Brexit, no matter how it goes. This tells you that the UK is in an extremely bad bargaining position. It also tells you to pay attention to Ireland. But let's first, as I promised, go territorially. Wales. Well, remember I said the Brexit is a vote for long-term economic decline. Wales is north of the Severn to the Wash line, poorly educated, aging, high levels of disability, bad life expectancy, the usual. Its economic structure can be summarized as public sector and retail. In other words, the NHS provides healthcare and employs the middle class, which allows the retail sector to employ the working class. That's the Welsh economy. I'm really not oversimplifying by much. So, you take away the EU funds that have been building its infrastructure since 1973, and did a mighty good job of it, but they're going to go away now. And you tank the British economy, in particular the tax base for the public services, and the Welsh are going to participate in the long-term decline of the peripheral Great Britain economies. That's the Welsh story. The only other interesting thing is the social cleavages in Wales are many, and the best predictor of voting for Brexit was being an English retiree in Wales among the Welsh population. Scotland is more interesting. Its economy is slightly more diversified. Most of Scotland is the same peripheral Britain model of a public sector and a retail sector, and the distribution, aka trucking sector, that comes with it. But it's also got some oil, which is sometimes quite valuable and sometimes not so valuable. And it has a finance sector, although you do not have a long-term viable finance sector if you're anywhere near London. London's magnetic powers are excessive. That's like saying you have a big finance sector in Boston. You do relative to nothing, but not relative to New York. Now, the current legislation that is having an extremely awkward passage through Parliament in Westminster, which has the amazing legal task of formulating essentially everything about how the UK will operate, trying to replace about 38,000 pages of legislation. One of the things it does is whenever they don't know what to do, they give the power back to Westminster. Specifically, they give it to the Secretaries of State, so the cabinet ministers, not the Westminster Parliament, and, in most cases, not the Scottish Parliament. So huge areas of Scottish power shared with the European Union are going to become areas of the London government's power. And not even the Westminster Parliament, where, say, Scottish National Party MPs have a say. It's going to become the personal decision of the Secretary of State for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs what Scottish agricultural policy looks like. So, big power grab against the Scottish Parliament. Amusingly, the legal name for these powers is Henry VIII powers, because Henry VIII tried to claim them, and he was fought back by Parliament, and no one has tried since. In addition, Scottish politics is, of course, shaped by the independence referendum legacy. A lot of people were joking immediately after the referendum. It was a really good couple of weeks for black humor, that David Cameron was going to go down as the worst prime minister in British history because at least Lord North didn't offer the American colonies a referendum. It was taken for granted that Scotland, after the electoral performance and what I've just described, would make another break for independence. That's not happening. There's been practically no change in intention to vote if there's a new referendum, and there's a low submajority level of public support for having a new referendum in Scotland. Remember, the lived experience of Britain is that things are a little bit worse than in 2016. And if you happen to think Brexit is a good idea, it's nowhere near enough to persuade you that things have changed. The SNP, meanwhile, has its own fish to fry. It's a generational party. The only party I can think of that has so clearly got a generational component is the PQ in Quebec, which is now on the decline side. Everyone in the SNP is basically from aged 45 to 55 among the party leaders. Their political recruitment is remarkably poor below that age. They get young voters, but how long, young voters are volatile, as Callie pointed out. There's also, this is where we had a conversation 2 weeks ago, Scotland has a sort of natural center of gravity of left-wing voters in the west of Scotland where half the population lives. For a long time, that was Labour. And the SNP were up with the Conservatives in the rural north, where I did research there, and I literally would meet people who told me their value in terms of how many cows they owned. It was like interviewing in the Maasai or something, where he'd say, I'm a substantial man, I have X hundred cows. And I think no one has ever introduced themselves to me that way before. So up in the cow country, you got the SNP, and then down in Glasgow, you got Labour. This helped stabilize the United Kingdom. There's a form you find in a bunch of European countries, Belgium, Spain, where the center-left socialist Social Democratic Party was the party nationwide, and the Conservative Party was the party of the dominant nationality. You see that in the UK for a while now. The Conservatives are the English National Party, basically. And then Labour was the party of the United Kingdom, and Labour internalized the disputes over how much autonomy Scotland or Wales should have. Just like in Spain, the socialists were the party of Spain, and the Partido Popular is the party of Spanish people who don't regard themselves as Catalan or Basque. So one of the casualties of the ongoing disintegration of European social democracy is multinational states that were held together by the fact that they had a strong socialist party everywhere. In Scotland, the particular form this is taking is that the SNP ideologically has shifted solidly left, and it's racking up enormous electoral victories where Labour used to be. Labour in Scotland is nearly dead. The cow country, the guys who are out there counting their cows to demonstrate their social value, are voting UK Conservative. Scotland has a center-left majority at practically all times. The center-left party of Scotland dominating that electoral bloc is secessionist. The center-right is now a flatly unionist party. There is no party really committed to trying to manage a multinational state. And if you want to spend money on the NHS in Scotland, you are also going to vote for secession. And if you want to cut taxes and spend what remains of the tax burden on pensions, you are also going to vote for the Union and Brexit because you're going to vote Conservative. That's really poisonous. When you get that kind of overlapping cleavage, it says you're going to have instability coming. All you want is a better NHS, and you vote to leave the United Kingdom effectively. All you want is a better pension, and you vote to leave the EU. You thought that was a headache. I hope you've enjoyed the flags. Always remember, that is the color of the Scottish flag. People often render it far too dark. That's the color of a beautiful Scottish summer sky. If you like flags, however, I recommend Northern Ireland, where this is a small sampling of the flags for which you can get shot. That's the Northern Ireland flag. That's the Northern Ireland Assembly flag, which nobody recognizes. They came across the most innocuous symbol they could. It's a linen plant. That, of course, is the flag of what about half of the population of Northern Ireland want to live in, namely the Republic of Ireland, and that's the Orange Order, which doesn't agree. Tangling with Northern Ireland is not necessarily a good idea. Belfast is full of these. They're kept repainted. They're maintained. If somebody wants to paint one on your house, you say yes. Look at how that's put together. There's the gun. There's the graves of what we would call sectarian drug-dealing hoodlums, who they call, heroes. There's the Protestant iconography. That's a bad version. Mysteriously, they have an affection for the heavy metal band Iron Maiden, so they like to paint Eddie, who is the mascot of this heavy metal band, as a Protestant warrior. The skull means what it means, and of course the Scottish flag, just because the UK is really interesting. I want to underline there's history here. This is an internationalized conflict that in one way or another has been going on for 500 years. Extremely high levels of violence are present in the minds of everybody, and normal day-to-day violence, throwing rocks across the peace line at the other religious community, has been going up steadily for about a decade. Northern Ireland is a much more sectarian tinderbox than we think about. So you're not dealing with anything good. And these are all new, fresh photographs. There's the "you are entering loyalist Sandy Row" pro tip. If you're Catholic or are not white, turn around right here. This is a rather amazing IRA mural pointing out that Ernesto Che Guevara, Che's last name was Lynch, and highlighting the Irish revolutionary tradition's global impact. This is a rather remarkable one in which they take a legendary Irish king from a billion, pre-Christian times and turn him into a Protestant warrior. And that's a thing I've seen plenty of in Western Northern Ireland. That's to make a point to the British. You come out here in a police car, you might meet him. This is all 2017. I would like to make a historiographical point at this juncture. People like to write about British history and politics as if Ireland didn't exist. Here's a few highlights to point out why that's not a good idea. Top left, Larne gun running in 1914, when essentially, to prevent Irish Home Rule, the Protestant Unionists of Northern Ireland imported guns from Germany right before World War I and were on the brink of staging a coup. The military made it clear that they would side with these rebellious Ulster Protestants importing guns from the country Britain would be at war with in months. People forget, World War I saved the United Kingdom from a coup. That's hard to get in your head. I didn't believe it the first time I read it. Then, a few years later, that's what remained of Dublin, the General Post Office, after the Irish Uprising, which led to a giant civil war on Britain's front door and the independence of what's now the Republic. Getting a little more timely, that is a bus exploded at Aldwych, typical of what the IRA can do in London. Probably it would take a little while to get back up to that level of efficacy now, but it does have a way of coming home. And this is really important, if less known. That's a picture of events at the Ulster Workers' Council strike, when, led by Ian Paisley and the Democratic Unionist Party, the loyalist Protestants of Northern Ireland staged a general strike that basically led to the collapse of civil government. They've done that twice in my lifetime, and I'm not that old. Bear that one in mind. We all instinctively worry about blowing up London, because Most people think London is nicer and more interesting than Northern Ireland. But pay attention to what Ulster loyalists can do. So let's go back to Brexit. Here are the full range of logical options. A hard land border, right there. This is the United Kingdom's only land border with the EU. So let's have one where the United Kingdom borders a different country. Put up a hard land border, put up the fences, put up the security, put down the dogs, put up all the things that you find within 50 or 100 miles of a major international border between two jurisdictions. Second option, a hard sea border. Right off Northern Ireland, let it effectively remain part of the EU and then have customs when you try to cross the water. That makes sense to a lot of English people, which tells you something about how the English think about Ireland. Have a soft border. Make that border matter much less by retaining as much as you can of the current situation where trucks just drive back and forth. Guinness estimates that what will become your pint of Guinness, the ingredients have crossed that border 8 times to make beer. It's practically impossible to fly into Belfast because everyone just flies into Dublin and takes the train up. That kind of thing, if you want to preserve it, you need a very high level of UK integration with the Republic. And remember, the Republic is not its own actor, it's part of the EU. Final one, which conservative peers in the House of Lords like to bring up periodically, is that Ireland rejoins the United Kingdom and they leave the EU together. I only include it because A, it's a logical possibility, and B, there's some really amazing people in the House of Lords. So, let us go to the EU political context. That, by the way, is what the sky usually looks like by day in Northern Ireland. The Republic of Ireland, as you saw from that initial economic impact map, is going to take a hell of a beating from Brexit. Remember that pint of Guinness. Even if Guinness, say, concentrates all their production south of the border, that's an enormous amount of disruption. So the Republic has an interest in minimizing the impact of Brexit. The Republic is also a far more powerful actor than anybody in London wants to accept. Here's why. First of all, it's got effectively used soft power. They host European Union events and they host them well. Irish people, I hate to stereotype, but there are many people hailing from the Republic of Ireland who are fun to hang out with. This is noticed in Brussels, to the point where lobbying companies will preferentially hire Irish people because they're more fun. And if the point is to make friends with powerful people, being fun is quite a career asset. There's a lot of Irish soft power. They're one of the countries that has influence way beyond their population size and economy. Secondly, there's social credit. If you kind of do a model of how European Union decision-making works, the Republic is better positioned, again, than people in London like to think. One of the most important things, and I've actually put down a citation, Luc van Middelaar, who is a Dutch politician trained as a political theorist, wrote this in a lovely book, basically points out the extent to which the European Union is a social phenomenon, that it has grown together, that heads of state meeting in the Council come to think of themselves as a group whose solidarity is a value in its own right. If you misbehave, if you don't act like you're part of a group, if you don't act like the European Union is a joint enterprise to which you are committed, if instead you see the European Union as a transactional enterprise from which you get money and occasionally go showboating, then you are Greece and you will learn how kind your European partners can be to you when you're down. The exact same thing applies to the UK. The soft power, the competence of individual British people and of the Whitehall civil service has masked the fact that essentially since Tony Blair decided to jump on the side of George W. Bush during the Iraq War, the UK has been vaporizing much of its former institutional power in Brussels. It is not regarded as a productive, constructive, or competent actor. Just trace it out. The bloom came off the rose when Tony Blair went to Iraq. Gordon Brown didn't even wear his translation headphones during meetings because none of his fellow European ministers had anything valuable to say. David Cameron, enough said, Brexit. Positive comparison, if you like the collapse of democracy, is of course Hungary, which is, which is, I would say, is not a democratic country at this time, but they have paid a lot of attention. They're smart. The Hungarian government has paid a lot of attention to staying in these networks of reciprocity. That's why Angela Merkel won't do anything to punish Hungary for abandoning the values that she says she holds dear, because she needs Hungarian votes, and the Hungarians are allies of her political party and the European institutions. From this you learn the Irish are doing everything right, and the British are doing everything wrong in terms of getting a good deal, and that's before Brexit. Afterward, March 30th, 2019, they're going to have a European Council meeting. One country is going to be in the room, and it's not going to be the UK. All the other member states can do deals with Ireland. They can get favors from Ireland. They can have long-term transactional relationships with Ireland. They can have friends. They can exchange officials, so German officials go to Dublin and Irish officials go to Berlin. The British are cashing out. That Prosecco is not going to do it. Given that, you need to pay a lot of attention to the Irish and their border. This is a pretty simple slide. The British have discovered that it is a land border with the European Union, that those are to be taken seriously, and that there's major issues. Customs fraud. If you do anything other than simply cut and paste existing European Union customs arrangement, then you will have an incentive to customs fraud. If British customs duties are lower, people import into Britain and smuggle into Ireland and thence into the EU. If British duties are higher, people import into the EU, take it to Ireland, and then smuggle it into Britain. Tax fraud. VAT makes you crazy, but just take my word for it that there's tremendous new opportunities for tax fraud. Smuggling, straight up smuggling, and of course human trafficking, which A, is a problem, B, Ireland's already got a problem with it, C, Britain's already got a problem with it, and D, the whole point of Brexit, in the eyes of many of its voters, was to keep people who weren't British from getting into the country. These all involve enormous sums of money and highly competent criminal networks. Against them, we have hand-waving. Technology-based solutions. Perhaps we can blanket the whole island of Ireland, which someone in Westminster has got to know involves a sovereign country that is not under UK rule, with cameras. And the cameras can see if all the trucks are going to the right places. Or trusted trader arrangements, where you make a deal with a multinational company that it will guarantee that you have the right things in the right trucks crossing the border. Pre-screened goods. God only knows what that means. You bring a cargo of stuff into Rotterdam, which was screened in the United States. The US authorities send the manifest to London, and we all pretend that nothing can go wrong in the trip from Philadelphia to Rotterdam to Dublin to Belfast to London. How people who live in London, which is one of the world's great ports, is therefore one of the great cities for thieving, can possibly think this is plausible is beyond me. But before I pick on Whitehall too much, the key problem goes back to what is your solution? We know how to solve this with a hard border. You build a wall. We know how to solve it by remaining in the EU. Let us therefore revisit the Irish options. Whoops, sorry. I forgot there's an even bigger mess. So in case you thought this was, resolvable, let us move on to the management of Irish politics by Theresa May. Ugly slide, I'm sorry. Start down here. This is Metro. How many people have seen a copy of Metro? What is it?
Free paper.
It's a free newspaper distributed in...
Public transportation. Yep.
And where's the public transportation in Britain?
All over the country. Cities.
London.
Cities as well.
About 85% of the trips on public transport in the UK, counting the train network, are in London. So you blanket the London transportation network, or you put anything in Metro, you're going to blanket the London transportation network. Metro is not circulated at all in Northern Ireland. If you find a copy, it's because someone brought one over on a plane. So, what's this? This is a wrapper, and that's a staggeringly expensive thing to put on a newspaper with the circulation and value of the metro. Remember, 8 million Londoners, commuters are a high-value market. That's a ton of money. Take back control, vote leave, vote leave. What a weird thing. That's the logo of a Northern Irish party that doesn't run a single candidate anywhere in Great Britain. So you might say, who are these Northern Irish people who have decided to spend a fortune of money promoting Brexit in London, where they have no political stake? Well, Northern Ireland doesn't actually have any campaign finance law, so the DUP is laundering money for God knows who. They're under no obligation to say who paid for this. Who are the DUP? Well, you could run that headline pretty much every day of that party's existence. But the key thing is that they are a highly sectarian. They overlap with a very, very heavy-duty evangelical church. Ian Paisley used to be a sort of lecturer at Oral Roberts University. So think heavy-duty upland South Carolina evangelical, with an added dose of anti-Catholicism, which they refer to papism. Catholicism is not a word you hear from the DUP much. They are loyalist, right? Loyalists are not unionists. Loyalists in an Irish context are people who are loyal to an image of the United Kingdom centered in the monarchy and Protestantism that the English don't believe in, and they consequently don't believe in the English. So it's a tenet of loyalism that the English will sell you out. You aren't loyal to the United Kingdom as she exists today. You are loyal to King Billy's Protestant power. If this language seems a little weird to you, that's the DUP for you. And so you expect to be sold out by the English, and you expect to resist. It's an interesting proposition in terms of political movements of history that think that way. So when you say a unionist, you mean someone in a sense you can do business with. A loyalist is somebody who expects to depend entirely on their own commitment and resources and God. They also, and this should be no surprise to you, are really quite into corruption. They're mostly the sort of New Jersey, Illinois, penny ante, I can't believe you're going to jail for £10,000 kind of corruption. Just check out the American South if you want to see how well strong eschatological evangelicalism and petty corruption go together, right? Well, it's the same formula. In part, they're the same people. Now, Theresa May, as we know, called an election that she shouldn't have last year and lost seats and lost control of the parliament and needed votes. And she did a little parliamentary arithmetic and she said the DUP has enough votes. So they said, initially there was horror, right? For example, would they try to ban gay marriage? Well, no, they're not stupid. So they asked for £1 billion. Everyone else in the country gets austerity. Northern Ireland gets £1 billion. Furthermore, I invite you to reflect on whether the services in Catholic areas will get that £1 billion. And they get a veto. This is the DUP said no to the British proposals for moving on from the first phase into the second phase of Brexit negotiations. Theresa May had to call them. A fudge was developed. Nothing was resolved. You're going to see that headline again. Okay, so Theresa May has made the UK government dependent on one of the most unusual and potentially destabilizing political forces you could ask for. Good move. So what's going on in Northern Ireland politics? This, by the way, is Stormont. That's kind of an astonishing building from which to govern 3 million people, I will point out. The Northern Ireland Assembly, ignored by anybody who doesn't read trivial circulation newspapers like the Financial Times and The Guardian, collapsed a year ago. The UK government, to whom Northern Irish governance reverted when that happened, called snap elections. The elections made things worse. First, they did not give anybody enough seats and will to form the coalition necessary under the arcane rules of the Northern Irish Assembly to form a government. So still no Northern Irish government. Furthermore, for the first time in the history of Northern Ireland, they didn't get a unionist/loyalist majority. So now the unionists and loyalists, broadly the Protestants, are frightened. The whole point of Northern Ireland, it got its borders drawn precisely to make sure it would always have a Protestant majority. That's not happening. So, if you're committed to a Protestant Northern Ireland, all this election did is make you less committed to Northern Irish self-governance under democratic rules. Therefore, we have a thing called direct rule. There's a formal status of direct rule. There's also an informal status of direct rule. Northern Ireland has been informally under direct rule, meaning that the Secretary of State for Britain, who is a GB politician from the Conservative Party with no electoral mandate in Northern Ireland, has been running Northern Ireland. So if you want to know why they're cutting maternity services at Whitehaven Hospital, the answer is that a guy who sits for the Midlands of England, elected into the Westminster Parliament, decided that was how he was going to balance the health budget. To which the rest of the world's answer is, if you would like to make your own decisions about the location of maternity services in your hospitals, you should try being capable of self-government. Now, in addition to this slow-burning crisis of democratic government in Northern Ireland that no one cares about, there's also the simple fact that the Good Friday Agreement, which is effectively the Constitution of Northern Ireland, makes no sense at all outside the European Union. Like, page after page of the agreement are nonsensical unless both Ireland and the UK are in the EU. So anybody in Northern Ireland with any grievance can point out that the whole of the Northern Irish political order is actually had its basic structure destroyed. I could go through the GFA, the Good Friday Agreement, in length, but over and over and over again, it depends on the European Union, because nobody thought that Brexit would happen when they agreed it. Austerity. Back when I was spending a lot of time in Northern Ireland, I had the good fortune to have dinner with a couple of Dagestanis. And I was explaining Northern Ireland, and I let slip that about 60% of the Northern Ireland workforce is in the public sector, and they're very well paid. And she said, oh, come on, I'm never going to listen to anyone from Northern Ireland again. If I could pay everyone in the Caucasus, 60% of the Caucasus population, a solid public sector salary, we wouldn't have wars either. Well, I won't get into the technicalities of intergovernmental finance in Britain because you'll all leave. But in an entirely predictable way, Northern Ireland really gets hurt by austerity. They call it the Barnett squeeze. Northern Ireland has been in a vise since 2010. It has been getting tighter and tighter. That's why they say they need their £1 billion. They're not getting their £1 billion because there's no government to give it to. London says when you are a government, you will get your £1 billion. But in the meantime, all those people who are essentially being paid a middle-class salary to do nothing in particular are not getting their middle-class salary. And Northern Ireland has a really well-educated population. They're the best educated population in the United Kingdom, actually. But oddly enough, every employer has the same proposal, which is, why don't you bring your good education where I choose to locate? So the Catholics move south to the Republic, and the Protestants move over into London. They don't stay in Northern Ireland and set up Silicon Valley. So essentially, if you're highly educated and in Northern Ireland, it means you work for the public sector and you haven't seen your pay increase for a decade. Happy people. So let's go back to the Irish border options in light of this. Hard land border. DUP says no. Dublin says no. Therefore, no. Hard sea border. Guess what? A loyalist party is not interested in supporting a UK government to cut it off and trap it on an island with what they would call the Fenians or the Papists, right? The DUP is completely uninterested in that, so they veto the proposal. To the mystification of people in London who are like, well, there's much more land traffic than sea traffic, so I'm sure you can live with it. No. Then there's the soft border. The problem with the soft border is that it depends on approximating the European Union to the United Kingdom, or more accurately, approximating the United Kingdom to the European Union. That's the fudge language they're using. But here's the problem. Every discrepancy between the UK and EU regulatory frameworks becomes an opportunity for more of the smuggling and the tax fraud that I was talking about. So the only way to make it really work is if you put the UK and the EU in a very tight relationship in which the UK takes its rules from the EU. The conservative right does not support that. My comment about fantasy politics is that the British political elite is acting like the only place in the British Isles is SW11AA, which is the postcode of the Houses of Parliament. They're not thinking about this. They're engaged in the much more pleasurable activity of figuring out whether Boris Johnson can eventually get rid of Theresa May and become Prime Minister. So they veto it. May made that official at a speech at Lancaster House, where she basically set out a group of red lines that mean that you cannot reliably approximate the UK's customs, tariffs, or regulatory structure to the EU. Therefore, you cannot have a soft border. And finally, Ireland is still not going to join Britain. So to sum up, the broad UK consequences: slow economic decline, fast geopolitical decline. The pro-Brexit areas are most likely to survive it. London is still your best investment if you want to move there. The most Remain areas are going to get hurt worst. Birmingham in particular was the biggest city to vote for Brexit, and you couldn't design an economy more likely to be hurt because it's got a very high level of integration into EU supply chains, and it does not have the most quality competitive producers. The West Midlands have price competitive producers. As soon as you levy a tariff on them, they're gone. Wales can, for these purposes, be treated as an area of declining provincial, largely rural England. Sorry, Wales. Scotland, in large part, suffers the same, but with the slight advantage that they have some world-recognized expertise and industries basically around Edinburgh and Aberdeen. And they have now been gifted with an overlapping cleavage where, as I said, if what you want is a better NHS, you vote for Scottish independence, and if you want a better pension and lower taxes, you vote for Brexit, right? Getting that kind of a cleavage overlaid on very deep social differences, Glasgow is nothing like the northeast of Scotland, is a formula for a dangerously divided country for a couple of generations. So if that happens, Scotland has a new problem that is by definition a problem of the UK. And there's Northern Ireland. There is no realistic border solution on the table, as my last slide I hope made clear. There is no realistic solution. There must be a solution. The only contingency planning is for essentially the Irish army to deploy along the border on March 29th at 11 p.m. Brussels time until something can be resolved. Nobody wants that. But all the previous, like I said on the previous slide, there's 4 logical solutions, and at the moment somebody has vetoed all 4 of them. The Good Friday Agreement, which governs Northern Ireland, is effectively comatose, because the rules under which Northern Ireland should be governed matter less if Northern Ireland is not being governed at all, which is the case. It's effectively under direct rule. It is effectively under direct rule by a UK government that is completely dependent upon the Democratic Unionist Party. So imagine what a moderate Catholic thinks of Theresa May's government. And there's the Republic. And every day, Britain loses a little bit more influence in the EU, and Ireland looks a little bit better to its colleagues. So, this is the conclusion. Brexit solves nothing in general, creates new problems, and it creates dangerous new problems in what had previously been comparatively stable territorial and national issues. Even the poor Welsh now have a linguistic divide that they didn't need because of Brexit. The Brexit negotiations are like accession in reverse. The EU has 2 characteristics. It negotiates a position and then it never wants to revisit its internal position. Its internal position is its position, and changing it takes years. They don't have years. And the EU is much bigger. Accession is where you basically are informed by the EU that you country are going to fulfill the EU's criteria, including adopting the 38,000 pages of legislation, and no, you don't get to amend it. This is an equivalently important power play. And the genius of the EU is that when you try to fight back, the bureaucracy swallows you up. Greece's finance minister, Yaros Varoufakis, who is a flawed character, wrote a very good book about the experience of being dragged underneath the quicksand of interchangeable men in dark suits who say things that don't make sense. That's what's happening to Britain now. Huge new problems in Ireland. Again, it annoys me when people try to write about British politics without mentioning Irish politics because, for example, World War I actually looks a lot more attractive if the alternative is civil strife and a civil war and possibly a coup, for example. And the UK government responses are nonsense. They presume technology that doesn't exist. They wish away problems. That whole paper I had a photo of is 22 pages long, and it's written in the style that anyone who teaches undergrads will recognize as the I'm only at 18 pages, maybe I can make it 2.2. Maybe I can incorporate a lengthy description from Wikipedia of the geology of Ireland, which they did. On the bright side, therefore, there are some options. An eternal transition period, which is the main threat identified by the Tory right. They want to make sure that they get the hardest and most inevitable Brexit possible because they're afraid that they'll be trapped in an eternal transition period and not be released. I put in European Economic Area, but the EU does have many available formulas that you could take off the shelf that would solve a number of problems, including the Irish border. However, Theresa May's Lancaster House speech with the red lines was specifically designed to prevent anything more integrated than the UK and Canada. Or call the whole thing off. Because the scenarios get freakier every day. There's no provision to move radioisotopes in and out of the United Kingdom. There's no provision to move commercial aircraft in and out of the United Kingdom. I could go on. If you're on radiotherapy for cancer in Britain, one hopes your therapy is concluded by March 2019. I'm of two minds whether I want to be in Britain for Brexit Day because there's a reasonable chance I wouldn't be able to get out again. Airlines are trying to schedule flights right now, and like everyone else, they're assuming things will be okay. But there's no legal basis for the assumption. Guinness is still shipping hops and grain back and forth across the border, assuming something will happen. Everybody's assuming they can make a special deal. Everybody's assuming they can make a special deal. Can everybody make a special deal? I'll go back and leave you with a photograph of Boris Johnson in a pickle. That's him, full of patriotism, stuck on a zipline. And that is being used by a French newspaper on the day after the referendum.
So we have 25 minutes for questions and discussion. Scott, I think you can handle the, but we do have a microphone because we are taping this event. It's important that you speak in the microphone, so you can raise your hand and we'll bring your microphone to you.
I'll come by.
So actually, the first question that I had was, you suggested the Dover scenario, that we should just iterate it across the whole of the UK, and I was just wondering if you could give us a few more instances just to make it even direr. And because I was curious, what other massive pilots are we looking at?
I'll start with commercial aviation. Like literally, there is no legal framework to move a passenger aircraft in and out of the UK. So that's a good one. Basically, the only way currently legally guaranteed to move it across British borders will be a ferry boat on Brexit Day. Radioisotopes is one of my favorites. Essentially, any regulatory framework, aviation safety, drug safety, these are areas where there is no UK capacity. It's an entirely European Union activity. Trade. They talk about WTO rules as if there's some kind of a basic thing that you can rely on. They're not. Nobody has a straight-up WTO rules-based relationship except for economies that don't trade at all, right? You make a list of economies where there's no bilateral underpinning for trade, and it's like Cape Verde and Bhutan. It's places where nothing moves between them, so they don't need any economic relationship. Result, though, is that the UK will over and over again have the choice of voluntarily imitating the EU and hoping everyone, including the EU, agrees with them, or losing that sector. And radioisotopes, by the way, because of the Euratom Treaty, is actually particularly difficult because obviously these are nuclear materials, they're dangerous, they're very tightly controlled, and they don't make them in the UK. And the EU does not have the liberty to just start sending highly dangerous radioactive materials across border to any old country without serious treaty changes. The UK did not have to drop out of Euratom. That's one of the many things that didn't have to happen, but that's one of the many things Theresa May screwed up. She said we'll drop out. She filed that in the Article 50 notification. So that's not necessary in the referendum. That's the action of Theresa May.
Quick follow-up and then Colin.
Is it, so what scenario would the very last one fall under if they can call it all off? I mean, what's the potential chain of events?
I would say that the non-crazy components of the Westminster political system, which are probably a narrow majority, although they're up against most of the Conservatives, all of the DUP, and Jeremy Corbyn, I'd say they're all waiting for something to go so horrifically wrong that it can't be managed. And I think that the political elites who want to remain are pretty confident that that's going to happen. Because what's going on right now is a giant campaign of public education where everybody belongs to an association of something. The students belong to the National Union of Students, and they're learning that their subsidized Erasmus studies at other universities will go away. People who own petrol stations are learning that they're going to pay higher taxes on the gasoline that they sell. Truck drivers are learning that they're going to spend God knows how much time at Dover. Doctors are learning that they're going to lose their nurses because the nurses are Spanish. I could go down the list. Every lobby in the country is demonstrating its utility to its members by sending out alarming things. So I get ones from the health sector, so I'm learning about isotopes going wrong and the drug market falling apart and the nurses leaving and the doctors leaving and the sad state of medical education and loss of European research funds and loss of European researchers. And the same thing's going on in the steel industry. The auto parts industry is freaking out. Again, remember what I said. You buy parts from the company in Birmingham not because of the quality, but because of the low price. That company in Birmingham is doomed. Companies are changing their plans. So, for example, a lot of the real low-end people who employ a lot of Eastern Europeans are already saying we're just going to give up on having low-end workers and automate. Banks are not loaning to companies dependent on Eastern European work, even to automate, precisely because the banks know that these companies have 1 year to completely change their operations. This is an enormous campaign of public education in which currently everybody's saying, we'll do a deal. So my people say, we'll do a deal to make sure we still have Spanish nurses and European research funds and radioisotopes. Yeah, but the auto industry says they're going to do a deal. And the supermarkets say they're going to do a deal. And road transport says they're going to do a deal. And the city says they're going to do a deal. And the creative industries say they're going to do a deal. At some point, everyone in the UK is going to have their own personal nightmare materializing in front of them in March of 2019. And that's the point where you say, we'd like to apply to revoke our Article 50 notification and begin talks on fudge, whatever. By which point the European Union will do what they did to Greece probably and get rid of the British rebate as the price.
One very, very broad question, one slightly more focused, but to which I have no idea of the answer. The very broad one was, I'd like you to say more about the people in the sense of all of those EU nationals currently living in some portion of the UK. And there was a point where you said, well, London will be okay, so you can still go to London. Well, if you're already in London, you may not be able to remain in London. But there are also a number of ways in which saying one can go, that anyone from anywhere can go to Britain is becoming dicier and dicier, as well as being able to remain EU national or not. So more on migration and immigration and all of that, the more pointed, but I don't know what the answer is. As you know, there's a very peculiar relationship that long predates the EU between the UK and the Republic of Ireland in terms of political rights, free migration.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in effect, Irish people can go to Britain with no restraints, including on the kinds of political rights and lives that they have once there.
Mm-hmm.
What does all of this mess mean for that? Because it is an arrangement that predates the EU, and yet removing the UK from the EU seems to me like it would complicate that.
I am overjoyed at your question because I wasted so much time trying to get answers. The answer is that there are, if you like Irish administrative history, a series of legal instruments that effectively amounted to a full-on zone of common market, free mobility, free trade, and free access to deserved government benefits. At any given time, there's an enormous number of people in Ireland receiving British military pensions. All of that legal apparatus that had been so carefully built from the 1940s through the 1960s has been removed because EU law did it better. So the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1964, which is the core legal document, appears in like 8-point type in an annex to a document in the European Union and in laws in Ireland and the UK, basically saying it is now gone. We do not require it anymore. So they've actually wiped out that legal structure because the EU replaced it all very neatly. And it worked exceptionally well because they got to use the same administrative arrangements, but the law's gone. And it's a rare bureaucrat who's going to, persist with an administrative arrangement that has no legal cover. If it can help amuse you, by the way, I actually met a guy who was from West Belfast, which is a predominantly Catholic area, and it's the heartland of the urban IRA. And he was achieving nothing in his 20s, and he ran into Jerry Adams in a pub. Jerry Adams said, "Sean, you're smart, you should make something of your life." So he joined the British Army. Went back to visit his family, and Jerry said, "That's not what I meant." The nice thing about being from Belfast is that they were guaranteed not to post you to Belfast. So he spent in Germany. On the people. Okay, so basic point is nobody who is reliant on free movement in or out of the UK should be anything other than extremely nervous. The relatively low income 800,000 British pensioners, mostly in Spain, should be intensely nervous. And the millions of hardworking Europeans in the UK should be intensely nervous. And that is how it breaks down, by the way. The UK sends pensioners on limited income and gets some of the highest value-added labor force you're going to get out of the EU. They counted, there's 8 known Spanish pensioners in the UK. 8 Spanish people retired to the UK. It was a wonderful moment in a Commons hearing when this was asked. So they should all be intensely nervous. And I can make specific guesses, like I'm one of the few people in North America who thinks about how Andalusia finances care for old English people. But nobody who says they know what's going to happen is telling the truth. Because it's a negotiation, and the UK government, in the spirit of pleasing the people it thinks are its base who are apparently bigoted, has made it clear that EU citizens are bargaining chips, in so many words. Here's why Brexit is negative sum for everybody. Let's be a talented Bulgarian from a family of no specific wealth, power, cultural capital, just smart. Gets a PhD from a good university. What are his job options? There's very few open labor markets in the EU. His options are basically to apply for a job with low transaction costs in the Netherlands and in the UK, which are the two, count them, 2 systems that do meritocratic hiring on a large scale within the EU. So he can apply for Dutch and British jobs. The Dutch higher education system is not endless. The British is far bigger and frankly better. So you take away Britain, he doesn't get one of the relatively small number of Dutch jobs. What are his options now? He can apply in the international market. He can apply here. He can apply to the European Commission. He can go back to Bulgaria and do something for which he is totally overqualified because he's still, I've ruled it out, not getting a job in the Bulgarian university system or civil service. So this is negative sum. We take a talented researcher. By taking away the UK, his career suddenly loses the key option for him to be a productive scholar. The UK also loses because they could underpay him. And we know in all areas of high-skilled professional labor, the one thing you never, ever, ever want to do is get into a competition with the United States. And the British, as usual, have been running a higher education system that relies on there being the labor market of last resort for the EU to avoid paying rates that would compete with the US. So what are the British options now that they don't have the Bulgarian? They can pay American rates. They can run down the system. So iterate that across every high-skilled category of worker I know of. The British have been underpaying because of the EU, and now they're going to have to compete with the United States on salary and immigration. And meanwhile, our poor Bulgarian is waiting on his application to the European Commission, which is nicer than being a shopkeeper in Bulgaria, but it ain't a university post. Same thing, doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, you name it.
You may have made a passing comment, but I didn't catch it. Could you comment on the pharmaceutical industry in Britain and how this Brexit, if the movement of medications out of Britain to United States, how that could be affected?
Okay. I've been getting a crash course in the pharmaceutical industry since the Brexit vote. Really high-skill global industries, such as information technology and most areas of medical research, have to locate where the workforce is. Right? Companies do not have the option of pitting Missouri against Kansas to locate a pharmaceutical lab because neither Missouri nor Kansas has a labor force that can staff a pharmaceutical lab. There aren't that many places in the world. If you want industrial engineering, you're going to open an office here, in Germany, and in the Tokyo-Nagoya basin. That's where the world's industrial engineers are. If you're going to do pharmaceutical research, you're going to open an office in New Jersey. You're going to open an office somewhere in sort of Switzerland, France area, and you're going to open an office in Cambridge. Those people are not going to move in the next year. Some of them will because they don't like the environment, but if your options are New Jersey, which is governed by Donald Trump, and Switzerland, which has been governed by the populist radical right for ages, if your problem is people being cruel to you because you're not from that country, neither Donald Trump nor Switzerland solves your problem. Plus, you have a house in Cambridge. So the pharmaceutical employment is going to be relatively stable, which means Cambridgeshire, which voted something like 85% to stay in, is going to suffer relatively little in the short term. Now, Britain lost to the European Medicines Agency. They ended up drawing names from a hat, and Amsterdam was pulled out of the hat, so that's why the European Medicines Agency, which is the FDA, is going to Amsterdam. They had to get on with the meeting. Everybody wanted the agency, so hat. That's the kind of social thing I was talking about. You only do that among friends, right? Losing EMA is going to hurt. It's going to be a boost for the Dutch efforts to build what biomedical research capacity they have. They're mostly in devices, which the same agency covers. So they're losing having the regulator on your doorstep. Also, insofar as they diverge from the EU, same thing as always. The more they diverge, the lower they down on the global priority. Because if I have a new drug, I'm going to immediately put it on the American and the European markets. The UK market, since I won't be able to get on it through mutual recognition, suddenly it's kind of like, do I invest in the UK? Do I invest in Japan? Do I invest in China, India, Australia? How much money am I going to make so you don't get the newest drugs? They pay a little less attention to you. Over time, how do we maintain this hub of pharmaceutical tax revenue and employment in Cambridgeshire? You need a high level of openness, a high level of regulatory agreement with the EU, lots of immigrants, and really good universities. I would submit that the current Conservative government is undermining all of those. In general, it's a wonderful government. It's conducting a laser strike on all the major sources of tax revenue in the United Kingdom. Like, if you set out to wreck your tax base, you would do what they're doing. And the bright side, people say, is that, the city will have to employ British people. No, that's not how finance works. They're going to move to Paris and employ the same people they always did. Pfizer's just not going to hire new people in Cambridge. Sure, they'll hire new people in New Jersey. Skadden Arps' London office will shrink a little and their Brussels office will grow a little. That's what slow decline feels like.
What about the other side? Other than you're falling and you're at the 30th floor, are you saying that there are some successes that are they pointing to benefits that are in the works?
Well, this clown says things that make no sense. Like, literally. Yeah. He wants to be prime minister and he's sad because he's not prime minister. But anything that has the level of tangibility of a policy, nothing. It's a joke. The Department for International Trade keeps talking about innovative jams. Breakfast fruit jam.
Jam tomorrow.
They're still talking, jam tomorrow, right? So the Department for International Trade is flacking for innovative jams and jellies from Devon, whatever the hell that means. They got a full week of good media coverage of the passport's going to be blue instead of maroon. By the way, you don't have to have a maroon passport as a member state. The UK chose to have a maroon passport. Now the UK is going to have a blue passport, which they could have had all along, and the tabloids go on about it for a week. 29th floor, so far so good. 28th floor, so far so good.
I have a more kind of general question. So it was famously reported from the EU Commission meeting when Cameron first told everyone else, I'm going to have a referendum. Mm-hmm. And they all were just like speechless. It's like, you're doing what? Because they knew in their countries, had they issued a referendum, mm-hmm. that they would vote out. And I think Macron said this somewhere in a conversation in the last week as well. Yeah. And we could see this happening in the US too. If you gave a referendum to an individual state to leave the US, they would do it too. So just in the way the conversation is going, we're all beating up on the English people mm-hmm. a lot about how stupid they are, and this is such a reckless decision. But you allow people to make a decision, and they've made it, and it's being managed poorly. And do you have some comment, I guess, on just that process and how it applies more globally, I guess?
Okay. First of all, as a political scientist at the University of Michigan, I am honor-bound to carry on the tradition of having very little respect for voters in the aggregate. We've been demonstrating that since the 1960s. It's a joke, but really there's a huge volume of literature on referendums, and the one thing you can safely say is that voters will answer the question they feel like answering and not the question that was posed. So, what did people think they were voting on for Brexit? There was a meaningful number who thought it was going to get rid of Secretary of State for Health Jeremy Hunt. So that's part of the problem, is if you have a referendum, you don't really know what's going to happen. The Scottish referendum was unusually good in terms of public education, and there's still a large number of people whose rationale for voting has very little to do with anything that was on the ballot. I am therefore sympathetic to the civil servants. I am not sympathetic to conservative politicians, but the civil servants, they did a poor job on, for example, the Irish border paper because there isn't a solution within the parameters that they were given. There just isn't, unless you can persuade the Irish to rejoin the United Kingdom. So that's why, in a sense, you have this let's all wait for something to go wrong. Now, then, are people legitimately dissatisfied with their political elites? Again, I think that there's sort of a massive amount of evidence from essentially everywhere that they are. And one small amount of it is referenda on the EU, which if you offer people the opportunity to put a brick through the windows of their political elites, they're very likely to want to do it. And frankly, I've got some sympathy with that. I think we all do. And I forgot one other component of your question that I thought was the real best bit.
I think it's more just what it means kind of more globally, in the sense that, what it means for democracy, right? Because we would see referenda as being fundamentally the core root of what a democratic institution is. And I guess you made a comment at the start as well about the fracture of the social democracy with the fracturing of political parties. But I guess, are these bad things necessarily? And, there's this conflict there.
Yeah, it is one of the great problems of the last few years of my career. The main thing I'm known for in EU circles is being extremely cynical about the European Union and social policy and health, because it's pretty much unarguable that the European Union structurally does a lot of things that undermine the welfare state, undermine people's individual security, and so forth. Just the way that the EU is set up is not good for an egalitarian and sustainable health service. And the Eurozone, which Britain is of course not part of, is really bad for most of the things that any good social democrat would want. And I would say that there is a noticeable relationship that all the social democratic parties that have really collapsed have been in the European Union. And the ones showing signs of rebirth are outside the Eurozone and mostly outside the EU. Here's the thing. One, the EU has been profoundly shaped by the UK. The great joke, if you're sitting in particularly Western continental Europe, if you're sitting in, say, Belgium, is the UK got everything it wanted at the expense of Belgium and Belgian preferences, and now they want to leave. This is very hard to explain to a Belgian. So this machine worked particularly well for, how shall I put it, the political and economic regime of modern Britain, right? They built the EU that services the UK as it works today, and as many of its voters feel it does not work, right? They built the the economy that essentially is based on very high-end rent-seeking services, research and development of this and that, and a lot of low-wage jobs, right? That model was something that the UK did a very good job exporting into European law of all kinds. Now what happens? The UK has its own private problems, of which I've addressed a few. The real loser is Germany in the EU, and the real winner is France. Because you cannot build a political coalition in the EU without two of the three big countries. And each of these countries has a retinue of small countries that vote with it. So the German vote almost automatically tells you the Austrian vote. The French vote almost automatically tells you the Spanish and Italian votes. The British vote almost automatically tells you the Dutch and Baltic votes. Take out Britain. The Baltic states and Sweden and the Netherlands are not a bloc that's going to drive any decision. Suddenly, you go from the old happy position for Berlin, where they could side with the British and win, or they could side with the French and win. That's over. Now we're back to the old school European Union, in which the Germans and the French do a deal. And there's no bloc that can ally against them. So it's a great day for French foreign policy. I mean, Brexit is the best thing you could have done for the power of France, and therefore for the persistence and possible expansion of the social model associated with France, which the one thing you can say for it is that it's a lot more generous than the social model that Britain supports.
Well, that's enough to ending. Perfect to close the talk. Thank you so much for this excellent, fascinating, but slightly if not thoroughly depressing analysis. Thank you so much.